Spoken Realms and Mike Vendetti Productions proudly present Look Homeward, Angel, a story of buried life by Thomas Wolfe, narrated by Mike Vendetti. Part 1. A stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Of a stone, a leaf, a door, and all of the forgotten faces. Naked and alone we come into exile. In her dark womb we do not know our mother's face. From the prison of her flesh have we come into the unspeakable and incommunicable prison of this earth. Which of us has known his brother? Which of us has looked into his father's heart? Which of us has not remained forever prison pent? Which of us is not forever a stranger and alone? O waste of loss in the hot mazes, lost among bright stars on the most weary, unbright cinder, lost. Remembering speechlessly, we seek the great forgotten language, the lost lane into heaven, a stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Where? When? O lost and by the wind grieved, ghosts come back again. 1. A destiny that leads the English to the Dutch is strange enough, but one that leads from Epsom into Pennsylvania and thence into the hills that shut in Altamont over the proud choral cry of the cock and the soft stone smile of an angel, is touched by that dark miracle of chance which makes new magic in a dusty world. Each of us is all the sums he has not counted. Subtract us into nakedness and night again, and you shall begin in Crete. 4,000 years ago, the love that ended yesterday in Texas. The seed of our destruction will blossom in the desert. The election of our cure grows by a mountain rock, and our lives are haunted by a Georgia slattern because a London cutpurse went unhung. Each moment is the fruit of 40,000 years. The minute-winning days, like flies, buzz home to death, and every moment is a window on all time. This is a moment. An Englishman named Gilbert Gaunt, which he later changed to Gant, a concession probably to Yankee phonetics, having come to Baltimore from Bristol in 1837 on a sailing vessel, soon left the profits of a public house which he had purchased rolled down his improvident gullet. He wandered westward into Pennsylvania, eking out a dangerous living by matching fighting cocks against the champions of country barnyards, and often escaping after a night spent in a village gaol, with his champion dead on the field of battle, without the clink of a coin in his pocket, and sometimes with the print of a farmer's big knuckles on his reckless face. But he always escaped, and coming at length among the Dutch at harvest time, he was so touched by the plenty of their land that he cast out his anchors there. Within a year he married a rugged young widow with a tiny farm who, like all other Dutch, had been charmed by his air of travel and his grandiose speech, particularly when he did Hamlet in the manner of the great Edmund Kean. Everyone said he should have been an actor. The Englishman begot children, a daughter and 4 sons, lived easily and carelessly, and bore patiently the weight of his wife's harsh but honest tongue. The years passed. His bright, somewhat staring eyes grew dull and bagged. The tall Englishman walked with a gouty shuffle. One morning, when she came to nag him out of sleep, she found him dead of an apoplexy. He left 5 children, a mortgage, and his strange dark eyes, which now stared bright and open. Something that had not died, a passionate and obscure hunger for voyages. So with this legacy we leave this Englishman, and are concerned hereafter with the heir to whom he bequeathed it, his second son, a boy named Oliver. How this boy stood by the roadside near his mother's farm and saw the dusty rebels march past on their way to Gettysburg. How his cold eyes darkened when he heard the great name of Virginia, and how the year the war had ended, when he was still 15, he had walked along a street in Baltimore and seen within a little shop smooth granite slabs of death, carved lambs and cherubim, and an angel poised upon cold Chiswick feet, with a smile of soft stone idiocy. This is a longer tale, but I know that his cold and shallow eyes had darkened with the obscure and passionate hunger that had lived in a dead man's eyes, and that had led from French Church Street past Philadelphia, as the boy looked at the big angel with the carved stripe of lily stalk. Cold and nameless excitement possessed him. The long fingers of his big hands closed. He felt that he wanted, more than anything in the world, to carve delicately with a chisel. He wanted to wreak something dark and unspeakable in him into cold stone. He wanted to carve an angel's head. Oliver entered the shop and asked a big bearded man with a wooden mallet for a job. He became the stone cutter's apprentice. He worked in that dusty yard 5 years. He became a stone cutter. When his apprenticeship was over, he had become a man. He never found it. He never learned to carve an angel's head. The dove, the lamb, the smooth-joined marble hands of death, and letters fair and fine, but not the angel. And of all the years of waste and loss, the riotous years in Baltimore, of work and savage drunkenness, in the theater of Booth and Salvini, which had a disastrous effect upon the stonecutter, who memorized each accent of the noble rant, and strode muttering through the streets with rapid gestures of the enormous talking hands. These are blind steps and gropings of our exile, the painting of our hunger as, remembering speechlessly, we seek the great forgotten language, the lost lane end into heaven, a stone, a leaf, a door. Where? When? He never found it, and he reeled down across the continent into Reconstruction South, a strange, wild form of 6 feet 4, with cold, uneasy eyes, a great blade of nose, and a rolling tide of rhetoric, a preposterous and comic invective, as formalized as classical epithet, which he used seriously, but with a faint, uneasy grin around the corners of his thin, wailing mouth. He set up business in Sydney, the little capital city of one of the middle southern states, lived soberly and industriously under the attentive eye of a folk still raw with defeat and hostility, and finally, his good name founded and admission won, he married a gaunt, tubercular spinstress, 10 years his elder, but with a nest egg and an unshakable will to matrimony. Within 18 months, he was a howling maniac again. His little business went smash while his foot stayed on the polished rail. And Cynthia, his wife, whose life the natives said he had not helped to prolong, died suddenly one night after a hemorrhage. So all was gone again. Cynthia, the shop, the hard-bought praise of soberness, the angel's head. He walked through the streets at dark, yelling his pentameter curse at rebel ways, and all their indolence. But sick with fear and loss and penitence, he wilted under the town's reproving stare, becoming convinced, as the flesh wasted on his own gaunt frame, that Cynthia's scourge was doing vengeance now on him. He was only past 30, but he looked much older. His face was yellow and sunken. The waxen blade of his nose looked like a beak. He had long brown mustaches that hung straight down mournfully. His tremendous bouts of drinking had wrecked his health. He was thin as a rail and had a cough. He thought of Cynthia now, in the lonely and hostile town, and he became afraid. He thought he had tuberculosis and that he was going to die. So, alone and lost again, having found neither order nor establishment in the world, and with the earth cut away from his feet, Oliver resumed his aimless drift along the continent. He turned westward toward the great fortress of the hills, knowing that behind them his evil frame would not be known, and hoping that he might find in them isolation, a new life, and recovered health. The eyes of the gaunt spectre darkened again, as they had in his youth. All day, under a wet gray sky of October, Oliver rode westward across the mighty state. As he stared mournfully out the window at the great raw land so sparsely tilled by the feudal and occasional little farms, which seemed to have made only little grubbing patches in the wilderness, his heart went cold and leaden in him. He thought of the great barns of Pennsylvania, the ripe bending of golden grain, the plenty, the order, the clean thrift of the people, and he thought of how he had set out to get order and position for himself, and of the rioting confusion of his life, the blot and blur of years, and the red waste of his youth. My God, he thought, I'm getting old. Why here? The grisly parade of the spectre years trooped through his brain. Suddenly he saw that his life had been channeled by a series of accidents. A mad rebel singing of Armageddon, the sound of a bugle on the road, the mule hoofs of the army, the silly white face of an angel in a dusty shop, a slut's pert wiggle of her hands as she passed by. He had reeled out of warmth and plenty into this barren land. As he stared out the window and saw the fallow, unworked earth, the great raw lift of the Piedmont, muddy red clay roads, and the slatterned people gaping at the stations, a lean farmer gangling above his reins, a dawdling Negro, a gap-toothed yokel, a hard, sallow woman with a grimy baby. The strangeness of destiny stabbed him with fear. How came he here, from the clean Dutch thrift of his youth, into this vast, lost earth of rickets? Train rattled on over the reeking earth. Rain fell steadily. A brakeman came trottingly into the dirty plush coach and emptied a scuttle of coal into the big stove at the end. High empty laughter shook a group of yokels sprawled on two turned seats. The bell tolled mournfully above the clacking wheels. There was a droning, interminable wait at a junction town near the foothills. Then the train moved on again across the vast rolling earth. Dusk came. The huge bulk of the hills was foggily emergent. Small smoky lights went up in the hillside shacks. The train crawled dizzily across high trestles spanning ghostly hawsers of water. Far up, far down, plumed with wisps of smoke, toy cabins stuck to bank and gulch and hillside. The train toiled sinuously up among gouged red cuts with slow labor. As darkness came, Oliver descended at the little town of Old Stockade, where the rails ended. The last great wall of the hills lay stark above him. As he left the dreary little station and started into the greasy lamplight of a country store, Oliver felt that he was crawling, like a great beast, into the circle of those enormous hills to die. The next morning he resumed his journey by coach. His destination was the little town of Altamont, 24 miles away beyond the rim of the great outer wall of the hills. As the horses strained slowly up the mountain road, Oliver's spirit lifted a little. It was a gray, golden day in late October, bright and windy. There was a sharp bite and sparkle in the mountain air. The range soared above him, close, immense, clean, and barren. The trees rose gaunt and stark. They were almost leafless. The sky was full of windy white rags of cloud. A thick blade of mist washed slowly around the rampart of a mountain. Below him a mountain stream foamed down its rocky bed, and he could see little dots of men laying the track that would coil across the hill toward Altamont. Then the sweating team leapt the gulch of the mountain, and among soaring and lordly ranges that melted away in purple mist, they began the slow descent toward the high plateau on which the town of Altamont was built. In the haunting eternity of these mountains, rimmed in their enormous cup, he found sprawled out on its 100 hills and hollows a town of 4,000 people. There were new lands. His heart lifted. This town of Altamont had been settled soon after the Revolutionary War. It had been a convenient stopping-off place for cattle drovers and farmers in their swing eastward from Tennessee into South Carolina. And for several decades before the Civil War, it had enjoyed the summer patronage of fashionable people from Charleston and the plantations of the hot South. When Oliver first came to it, it had begun to get some reputation not only as a summer resort, but as a sanatorium for the tuberculosis. Several rich men from the north had established hunting lodges in the hills, and one of them had bought huge areas of mountain land and, with an army of imported architects, carpenters, and masons, was planning the greatest country estate in America. Something in limestone, with pitched slate roofs, and 183 rooms. It was modeled on the Chateau at Blois. There was also a vast new hotel, a sumptuous wooden barn, rambling comfortably upon the summit of a commanding hill. But most of the population was still native, recruited from the hill and country people in the surrounding districts. They were Scotch-Irish mountaineers, rugged, provincial, intelligent, and industrious. Oliver had about $1,200 saved from the wreckage of Cynthia's estate. During the winter, he rented a little shack at one edge of the town's public square, acquired a small stock of marbles, and set up business. But he had little to do at first save to think of the prospect of his death. During the bitter and lonely winter, while he thought he was dying, the gaunt scarecrow Yankee that flapped muttering through the streets became an object of familiar gossip to the townspeople. All the people at his boarding-house knew that at night he walked his room with great caged strides, and that a long, low moan that seemed wrung from his bowels quivered incessantly on his thin lips. But he spoke to no one about it. And then the marvelous hill spring came, green, golden, with brief spurting winds, the magic and fragrance of the blossoms, warm gusts of balsam. The great wound in Oliver began to heal. His voice was heard in the land once more. There were purple flashes of the old rhetoric, the ghost of the old eagerness. One day in April, as with fresh awakened senses, he stood before his stoop, watching the fury of life in the square. Oliver heard behind him the voice of a man who was passing, and that voice, flat, drawling, complacent, touched with sudden light a picture that had laid dead in him for 20 years. "It's a-comin'. According to my figures, it's due June 11th, 1886. Oliver turned and saw retreating the burly, persuasive figure of the prophet he had last seen vanishing down the dusty road that led to Gettysburg and Armageddon. "Who is that?" he asked a man. The man looked and grinned. "That's Backus Pentland," he said. "He's quite a character. There are a lot of his folks around here." Oliver wet his great thumb briefly. Then, with a thin grin, he said, "Has Armageddon come yet?" "He's expecting it any day now," said the man. Then Oliver met Eliza. He lay one afternoon in spring upon the smooth leather sofa of his little office, listening to the bright piping noises in the square. A restoring peace brooded over his great extended body. He thought of the loamy black earth with its sudden young light of flowers, of the beaded chill of beer, and the plum trees dropping blossoms. Then he heard the brisk heel taps of a woman coming down among the marbles, and he got hastily to his feet. He was drawing on his well-brushed coat of heavy black just as she entered. "I tell you what," said Eliza, pursing her lips in reproachful banter, "I wish I was a man and had nothing to do but lie around all day on a good, easy sofa." "Good afternoon, madam," said Oliver with a flourishing bow. "Yes," he said, as a faint sly grin bent the corners of his thin mouth. "I reckon you've caught me taking my constitutional. As a matter of fact, I very rarely lie down in the daytime, but I've been in bad health for the last year now, and I'm not able to do the work I used to." He was silent a moment. His face dropped in an expression of hang-dog dejection. "Ah, Lord, I don't know what's to become of me." "Pshaw," said Eliza briskly and contemptuously. "There's nothing wrong with you in my opinion. You're a big, strapping fellow in the prime of life. Half of it's only imagination. Most of the time we think we're sick, it's all in the mind. I remember 3 years ago I was teaching school in Hominy Township when I was taken down with pneumonia. Nobody ever expected to see me come out of it alive, but I got through it somehow. I well remember one day I was sitting down, as the fellow says. I reckon I was convalescing. The reason I remember is old Dr. Fletcher had just been in, and when he went out I saw him shake his head at my cousin Sally. 'Why, Eliza, what on earth?' she said, just as soon as he had gone. 'He tells me you're spitting up blood every time you cough. You've got consumption as sure as you live.' So I said, I remember I laughed just as big as you please, determined to make a big joke of it all. I just thought to myself, I'm not going to give in to it. I'll fool them all yet. I don't believe a word of it," I said. She nodded her head smartly at him and pursed her lips. "And besides, Sally," I said, "we've all got to go sometime, and there's no use worrying about what's going to happen. It may come tomorrow, or it may come later, but it's all bound to come to all in the end." "Ah, Lord," said Oliver, shaking his head sadly. You hit the nail on the head that time. A truer word was never spoken. Merciful God, he thought with an anguished inner grin. How long is this to keep up? But she's a pippin as sure as you're born. He looked appreciatively at her trim, erect figure, noting her milky white skin, her black-brown eyes with their quaint child stare, and her jet-black hair drawn back tightly from her high white forehead. She had a curious trick of pursing her lips reflectively before she spoke. She liked to take her time, and came to the point after interminable divagations down all the lane ends of memory and overtone, feasting upon the golden pageant of all she had ever said, done, felt, thought, seen, or replied with egocentric delight. Then, while he looked, she ceased speaking abruptly, put her neat gloved hand to her chin, and started off with a thoughtful, pursed mouth. "Well," she said after a moment, "if you're getting your health back and spend a good part of your time lying around, you ought to have something to occupy your mind." She opened a leather portmanteau she was carrying and produced a visiting card in 2 fat volumes. "My name," she said portentously, with slow emphasis, "is Eliza Pentland, and I represent the Larkin Publishing Company." She spoke the words proudly with dignified gusto. Merciful God, a book agent, thought Gant. "We are offering," said Eliza, opening a huge yellow book with a fancy design of spears and flags and laurel wreaths, "a book of poems called Gems of Verse for Health and Fireside, as well as Larkin's Domestic Doctor and Book of Household Remedies, giving directions for the cure and prevention of over 500 diseases." "Well," said Gant with a faint grin, wetting his big thumb briefly, "I ought to find one that I've got out of that." "Why, yes," said Eliza, nodding smartly. "As the fellow says, you can read poetry for the good of your soul and Larkin for the good of your body." "I like poetry," said Gant, thumbing over the pages and pausing with interest at the section marked Songs of the Spur and Sable. "In my boyhood I could recite it by the hour." He bought the books. Eliza packed her samples and stood up, looking sharply and curiously about the dusty little shop. "Doing any business?" she said. "Very little," said Oliver sadly. "Hardly enough to keep body and soul together. I'm a stranger in a strange land." "Pshaw," said Eliza cheerfully. "You ought to get out and meet more people. You need something to take your mind off yourself. If I were you, I'd pitch right in and take an interest in the town's progress. We've got everything here it takes to make a big town. Scenery, climate, and natural resources. And we all ought to work together. If I had a few $1,000s, I know what I'd do." She winked smartly at him and began to speak with a curiously masculine gesture of the hand, forefinger extended, fist loosely clenched. "Do you see this corner here? The one you're on? It'll double in value in the next few years. Now here." She gestured before her with the loose masculine gesture. "They're going to run a street through there some day, as sure as you live. And when they do," she pursed her lips reflectively, "that property is going to be worth money." She continued to talk about property with a strange meditative hunger. The town seemed to be an enormous blueprint to her. Her head was stuffed uncannily with figures and estimates. Who owned a lot? Who sold it? The sale price, the real value, the future value, first and second mortgages, and so on. When she had finished, Oliver said with the emphasis of strong aversion, thinking of Sidney, "I hope I never own another piece of property as long as I live, save a house to live in. It is nothing but a curse and a care, and a tax collector gets it all in the end." Eliza looked at him with a startled expression, as if he had uttered a damnable heresy. "Why, say, that's no way to talk," she said. "You want to lay something by for a rainy day, don't you?" "I'm having my rainy day now," he said gloomily. "All the property I need is 8 feet of earth to be buried in." Then, talking more cheerfully, he walked with her to the door of the shop, and watched her as she marched primly away across the square, folding her skirts at the curbs with ladylike nicety. Then he turned back among his marbles again with a stirring in him of a joy he thought he had lost forever. The Pentland family, of which Eliza was a member, was one of the strangest tribes that ever came out of the hills. It had no clear title to the name of Pentland. A Scotch Englishman of that name, who was a mining engineer, the grandfather of the present head of the family, had come into the hills after the Revolution looking for copper, and lived there for several years, begetting several children by one of the pioneer women. When he disappeared, the woman took for herself and her children the name of Pentland. The present chieftain of the tribe was Eliza's father, the brother of the prophet Bacchus, Major Thomas Pentland. Another brother had been killed during the 7 days. Major Pentland's military title was honestly, if inconspicuously, earned, while Bacchus, who never rose above the rank of corporal, was blistering his hard hands at Shiloh. The major, as commander of 2 companies of home volunteers, was guarding the stronghold of the native hills. The stronghold was never threatened until the closing days of the war, when the volunteers, ambuscaded behind convenient trees and rocks, fired 3 volleys into a detachment of Sherman's stragglers and quietly dispersed to the defense of their attendant wives and children. The Pentland family was as old as any in the community, but it had always been poor, and had made few pretenses at gentility. By marriage and by intermarriage among its own kinsmen, it could boast of some connection with the great, of some insanity, and a modicum of idiocy. But because of its obvious superiority in intelligence and fiber, to most of the mountain people it held a position of solid respect among them. The Pentlands bore a strong clan-making. Like most rich personalities in strange families, their powerful group stamp became more impressive because of their differences. They had broad, powerful noses, with fleshy, deeply scalloped wings, sensual mouths, extraordinarily mixed of delicacy and coarseness, which, in the process of thinking, they convolved with astonishing flexibility, broad, intelligent foreheads, and deep, flat cheeks, a trifle hollowed. The men were generally ruddy of face, and their typical stature was meaty, strong, and of middling height, although it varied into gangling cadaverousness. Major Thomas Pentland was the father of a numerous family, of which Eliza was the only surviving girl. A younger sister had died a few years before of a disease which the family identified sorrowfully as poor Jane Scrofula. There were 6 boys. Henry, the oldest, was now 30. Will was 26. Jim was 22. And Thaddeus, Elmer, and Greeley were in the order named 18, 15, and 11. Eliza was 24. The 4 older children, Henry, Will, Eliza, and Jim, had passed their childhood and the years following the war. The poverty and privation of these years had been so terrible that none of them ever spoke of it now, but the bitter steel had sheared into their hearts, leaving scars that would not heal. The effect of these years upon the older children was to develop in them an insane niggardliness, an insatiate love of property, and a desire to escape from the Major's household as quickly as possible. "Father," Eliza had said with ladylike dignity as she led Oliver for the first time into the sitting-room of the cottage, "I want you to meet Mr. Gant." Major Pentland rose slowly from his rocker by the fire, folded a large knife, and put the apple he had been peeling on the mantel. Bacchus looked up benevolently from a whittled stick, and Will, glancing up from his stubby nails, which he was paring as usual, greeted the visitor with a bird-like nod and wink. Men amused themselves constantly with pocket-knives. Major Pentland advanced slowly toward Gant. He was a stocky, fleshy man in the middle 50s, with a ruddy face, a patriarchal beard, and the thick, complacent features of his tribe. "It's W. Grant, isn't it?" he asked in a drawling, unctuous voice. "Yes," said Oliver, "that's right." "From what Eliza has been telling me about you," said the Major, giving the signal to his audience, "I was going to say it ought to be L.E. Gant." The room sounded with the fat, pleased laughter of the Pentlands. "Ooh!" cried Eliza, putting her hand to the wing of her broad nose. "Oh, Val, Father, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Gant grinned with a thin, false painting of mirth. "The miserable old scoundrel," he thought. "He's had that one bottled up for a week." "You met Will before," said Eliza. "Both before and aft," said Will with a smart wink. When their laughter had died down, Eliza said, "And this, as the fellow says, is Uncle Bacchus." "Yes, sir," said Bacchus, beaming. "As large as life and twice as sassy." "They call him Bacchus everywhere else," said Will, including them all in a brisk wink. "But here in the family, we call him Behind Us." "I suppose," said Major Pentland deliberately, "that you've served on a great many juries." "No," said Oliver, determined to endure the worst now with a frozen grin. "Why?" "Because," said the Major, looking around again, "I thought you were a fellow who'd done a lot of courting." Then amid their laughter the door opened, and several of the others came in. Eliza's mother, a plain, worn Scotchwoman, and Jim, a ruddy, porcine young fellow, his father's beardless twin, and Thaddeus, mild, ruddy, brown of hair and eye, bovine, and, finally, Greeley, the youngest, a boy with lapping idiot grins, full of strange, squealing noises at which they laughed. He was 11, degenerate, weak, scrofulous, but his white, moist hands could draw from a violin music that had in it something unearthly and untaught. And as they sat there in the hot little room with its warm odor of mellowing apples, the vast winds howled down from the hills. There was a roaring in the pines, remote and demented. The bare boughs clashed, and as they peeled or pared or whittled, their talk slid from its ruled jocularity to death and burial. They drawled monotonously, with evil hunger, their gossip of destiny and of men but newly lain in the earth. And as their talk wore on, and Gant heard the spectre moan of the wind, he was entombed and lost in darkness, and his soul plunged downward in the pit of night, for he saw that he must die a stranger, that all but these triumphant Pentlands who had banqueted on death must die. And like a man who is perishing in the polar night, he thought of the rich meadows of his youth, the corn, plum tree, and ripe grain. Why here? Oh, lost,